Hello, today is Monday, October 2nd, 2023, and welcome to episode 256 of Fault Line, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm Jessica Jones, NSI Deputy Executive Director, and today I'm joined by Jamil Jaffer, NSI's very in-house media conglomerate, and Mita Vigna and Lester Munson, two NSI firebrands and senior fellows. Today, we're talking about Poland. With an election coming up next month on October 15th, the country finds itself extremely divided. The campaign tone has turned dark, and all eyes across the continent are watching. The country's ruling party, the Conservative Law and Justice Party, is trying to secure its third term in a row in government, and the opposition is rallying voters for a general election that they see as their last chance to save the country's hard-won democratic freedoms. Just yesterday on Sunday, large crowds of the opposition marched throughout Warsaw, converging around a giant flag commemorating a 1945 uprising against Nazi Germany and representing what some see as the biggest display of anti-government sentiment since Poland's Solidarity trade union movement rallied against communism in the 1980s. Beyond determining the Polish government, the US and our European partners are also watching the election with an eye towards the future of Polish support for Ukraine and Poland's future with the EU. The Law and Justice Party has been fighting the EU over judicial, media, and human rights standards ever since taking power in 2015. And in the last few weeks, it sent mixed messages about its policy towards Ukraine. So we've seen increasingly powerful Poland, which is, massive buildup of armed forces. It was one of the first countries to come to Ukraine's aid with major weapons deliveries, and it has a growing economy that has become the European Union's sixth largest. Are the U.S. policymakers and the Biden administration recognizing the importance of Poland? And is this election as important as the polls think it is? Jamil, I'll turn first to you.
Look, I mean, I think everyone recognizes how important the polls are to Ukraine's fight against Russia. They are the key conduit point for a lot of the weapons. They have provided a significant portion of the weaponry to Ukraine. They are at the heart of this fight, and the polls recognize that too. They recognize the very real threat that Russia poses. They've been invaded by Russia before. They've been invaded by Germany. They know what the threat looks like on their borders. That's exactly why they're engaged in this fight. Now, there is an internal fight going on. A lot of this turns on economics and the like. There's been this dispute over grain. But at the end of the day, I think the Poles are going to stick with the fight. They're going to stick with the support of Ukraine. There was one, concerning step back. The Prime Minister of Poland said that we're no longer arming the Ukrainians. We're now arming Poland. The president of Poland appears to have walked some of that back as well. But that's obviously a concerning statement. I don't think that's real. I think it's more electoral politics. I'm looking forward to seeing the Poles continue their support of Ukraine, but this just demonstrates that you can't take it for granted. And if the opposition party, succeeds, there'll be an ongoing debate too with them and the European Union. This isn't going to end, if the PAS party leaves power. They're unlikely to leave power. They're likely to stay in, and I think we're likely to see continued support for Ukraine.
Yeah. In addition to the election, Les, your thoughts on the election. Also, what do you think? Does this send a larger message about European unity towards support for Ukraine this election?
Jones, I want to go back to something you referenced in the opening, this idea, and I think it was in the New York Times, that the protests in Poland right now are somehow analogous to the Solidarity uprising against the Soviets 43 years ago. Nothing could be further from the truth. A people rising up against their foreign oppressor, a government imposed by the totalitarian state of the USSR, is completely different than democratic protests and demonstrations in a democratic republic like Poland is now. Yes, there are political disagreements in Poland. That is the whole point of a democracy. The polls will work this stuff out. Yes, some of the rhetoric coming out is not terrific, and we want to see them be more unified with the rest of Europe in the battle against Russia with respect to Ukraine, 100%. But let's give the polls some grace here. They're in a very tough spot. These grain deals flood their markets with cheap grain. That's bad for Polish farmers. There's a real political cost to that. We see that in our own country with respect to food aid all of the time. We see it with respect to our own votes on aid to Ukraine that the U.S. House just did last week. pushing that aid out of the budget deal to keep our own government open. So we are in really no position to be all preachy with the Poles, and particularly Western Europeans who are, under our nuclear umbrella, really ought to put a cork in it when it comes to criticizing Poland, which is a democracy. Yes, they may not agree with the ruling party on a lot of stuff. That's okay. That's how democracies work.
Morgan, what do you make of all of
rant
this?
over.
Yeah, no, I no, as a
left for that rant. I didn't even know it at the time, but I set it up for that rant.
Thank you.
As a national security professional of Polish descent, I am largely empathetic with Poland here. No, look, I mean, at the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, Poland was Ukraine's staunchest supporter. I would still argue that they are. Like, we're over a year and a half into this war in Ukraine. We're really starting to see sort of the fissures brought on by populist politics here. This is not the only European country where we're seeing this. Slovakia in particular is experiencing something very similar. And even in the United States, as Les mentioned, we saw funding for Ukraine stripped out of the continuing resolution in order to keep the U.S. government open. And frankly, though, the only country that benefits from this is Russia. Waning support for Ukraine and Poland and the United States, arguably two of the most important partner allies in NATO, when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine, it really doesn't help Poland at home. It certainly does not help the United States. And in fact, it makes us look more vulnerable. It makes us look weak because Russia will seize on this and really use it as an opportunity to build momentum and push westward.
Yeah, I think Morgan's exactly right. I think that that this whole issue is actually sweeping all of Europe, and this populism is not just in Europe; it's in the U.S. This is the kind of thing that's really problematic for any kind of foreign aid, particularly military aid. And so I think Morgan's exactly right. Interesting turn, though. You now see the British actually talk about training Ukrainians in Ukraine, so they're actually going the opposite direction. So there are some trends that cut the other direction as well.
I was wondering, Les, you mentioned the grain shipments and the domestic conversation in Poland going on and the fight over that. So we obviously had Zelensky at UNGA. What do we make about all of these, the populist movement across Europe with Ukraine trying to join NATO and the EU, which all of these conversations would bring up a whole lot of other issues. I mean, is this like a small microcosm of what would be a larger fight across the continent?
Yeah, I mean, let's be grounded in reality here. Europeans have struggled with conflicts with each other and kind of collective action through the EU and the United Nations and other things. This is so these kinds of disputes about who's the decision maker. What if Poland has to leave the decision about food markets to the EU? That's going to be bad for their farmers. They're going to want to own that decision. But then if all of the European countries own all of their own decisions, we're going to get back to some sort of, state-on-state conflict in Europe. Europeans tend to like to fight each other. And so if we can find ways to get them to not fight each other, it's worth the effort, I think. It's going to be a struggle occasionally. There are going to be issues like this where it looks like they can't get along on anything. We got to help them through it. There are cousins there in Europe. They share a lot of our values, and we should be there for them and let them, that we should be a shoulder they can come cry on. But at the end of the day, I think we do need to give the Poles some grace here. We need to realize that they are going to support Ukraine at the end of the day, probably all through the day, despite what some of the rhetoric has been. And let's just let them go do that.
Jamil, you kind of had an eye roll there at the beginning of Les's comment.
I mean, this idea that somehow Europe's going to descend into war if one nation doesn't support the EU or breaks out of the EU like the UK did, I just don't think that's real. I mean, even though they've been doing exactly that for 1,000 years. 1,000 years is what they do. The world's been at war for 1,000 years across all the continents. It's not just the Middle East. I mean, it's not just Europe. Let's be clear. I mean, I
don't know. They seem
Africa has had wars for. Okay. Well, I don't think the world ends if the EU collapses. I don't want the EU to collapse, but I don't think we end back into the 100 years of war. I don't think that's real.
I don't know if we just wrap the show on an optimistic tone or a really dark tone for the future of the world. I'm not sure, but that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Tatum Clifton and Claude Jennings and the rest of the NSI team for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Wednesday, October 4th for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're now on YouTube, so check us out there. And if you like what you heard, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.